Hey friends, it's me, Miss Terrell. Today we'll be talking about Reconstruction. This is kind of the last piece we need for period 5, and we are moving right along here. So Reconstruction, essentially looking at life in the South after the Civil War. So the war ends by April of 1865. Daily desertions had shrunk the Confederate Army considerably. On April 9th, in the small Virginia town of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee and Grant met in a private home and Lee surrendered. Southern soldiers could take their horses and mules and head home. They would not be tried as traitors, but they had to obey the laws of where they lived. And if you remember, a fun fact about the Civil War that we saw in that documentary today, the war started and ended on the same guy's property, which is pretty amazing. Lincoln, of course, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865 at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. I'm actually looking forward to going there this summer. There's a museum set up, so I'm pretty pumped about that. His death was felt on both the North and the South. Of course, Abraham Lincoln was a monumental president, and even if you hated him, you still had to respect him. So pretty, and the death of a president is a pretty serious moment in time. So it wasn't something that was cheered about countrywide. So, looking at Reconstruction specifically, the South was in complete ruin. Homes were destroyed, husbands were lost, cities also were in complete ruin. Charleston, here's just a quote from a passerby, essentially. Charleston was a city of ruins, of desolation, of vacant houses, of widowed women, of rotting wharves, of deserted warehouses, of weed-wild gardens, of miles of grass-grown streets, of acres of pitiful barrenness. The South was a pretty developed, although it was not industrialized, a pretty developed space, and now it essentially was completely destroyed, ruined. So they had a lot of work ahead of them. Between 1865 and 1877, the federal government carried out a program to repair the damage to the South and restore the southern states to the Union. The program was known as Reconstruction. At the time, Reconstruction was considered extremely controversial, and to this day, historians debate whether it's successful. They debate its successes as well as its failures. If you go to college and you want to major in something like history, you can take semester-long classes on Reconstruction. Personally, it is one of my favorite moments in U.S. history. I just think it's unique and different, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that pops out of this time period. Okay, just to give you some numbers, some statistics, so that you have an idea of the actual devastation of the South. The war essentially destroyed 2/3 of the South's shipping industry, 9,000 miles of railroads. It destroyed farmland, farm buildings, farm machinery, work animals. 1/3 of all the livestock was killed as a result of the war. Bridges, canals, levees, and thousands of miles of roads were destroyed and unusable. Factories, ports, and cities were essentially still smoldering. The value of farm property in the South plunged by about 70%. Also, the death tolls of the people in the South, or just the people in general as a result of the war. In the North, 364,000 soldiers were killed, including more than 38,000 African Americans. In the South, 260,000 soldiers, which is significantly less than the northern total. However, keeping in mind that the population of the South was significantly smaller than that of the North, essentially this number, 260,000, equals 1/5 of the adult white males living in the South, which is pretty significant. 1 out of 3 Southern men were killed or wounded. Not to mention those that came back that might have a mental instability dealing with the war in general. So the mental cost of war is almost as significant as the physical cost of war here. Most historians believe that the Civil War destroyed an entire generation of healthy young men. Okay, talking a little bit about what Southern society looked like after the war. Um, Number one, Black Southerners. Now we have 4 million freed people starting new lives in a poor region with already slow economic activity. When they were slaves, they received food and shelter, and now they found themselves homeless, jobless, and hungry. This is a big shift, even though they weren't treated well as slaves and they had no freedoms and so on and so forth. They had a place to stay, they had meals, they had clothing, they had a job, which obviously they weren't being paid for, but now they've just been turned out and essentially they have no place to go. So it's an interesting dynamic. Some freed slaves continued to work on their plantations. However, some left the South and some of them headed west. Two, plantation owners. Planters lost slave labor, obviously, with the emancipation. And this comes to a total of about $3 billion in slave labor lost. Some were forced to sell their property to pay their debts. They could not afford to hire the labor that they needed, and some could not go on as plantation owners. Our poor white Southerners, essentially, they could not find work because of the new job competition with the newly freed men. And so they began to migrate to the frontier lands in Mississippi and Texas and essentially looked for new opportunities. So looking at Reconstruction, President Lincoln, which of course this happened before he's assassinated, comes up with what he calls the 10% plan. The 10% plan offered a pardon, which essentially is official forgiveness of a crime. And he offered this pardon to any Confederate who would take an oath of allegiance to the Union and, of course, accept a federal policy on slavery. He denied pardons to all Confederate military and government officials and Southerners who killed African American war prisoners. And also, the 10% plan permitted each state to hold a convention with the goal to create a new state constitution. But this could only happen after 10% of the voters in the state had sworn allegiance to the Union. So, this is where the title 10% plan comes in. Also, the states could, after this happened with the 10% vote, states could then hold elections and resume full participation in the Union. The 10% plan under Lincoln did not require the new constitutions to give voting rights to African Americans, and importantly, it did set a tone of forgiveness for the post-war era. Now, after President Lincoln is assassinated, we see Andrew Johnson come into come in. He was the vice president, so he comes in as the president. And he himself was a former slave owner. He was born poor in North Carolina, and he started off as a tailor. He hated the rich planters of the South. He really didn't have much in common with them. As I said, he was born poor and came from meager beginnings. But he did find a lot of support from poor white Southerners. He is, however, one of the only folks who remained in Congress in the Union after the secession. So he comes up with what's called presidential reconstruction. And presidential reconstruction essentially is more generous to the South. It pardoned Southerners who swore allegiance to the Union. It permitted each state to hold a constitutional convention so that the states could come up with their own constitution. States were required to void the secession, abolish slavery, and repudiate the Confederate debt. And states after they did this could then hold elections and rejoin the Union. Many people thought that this was a good deal for the South in terms of Reconstruction. So now we know the slaves have been emancipated, and it's important for us to take a look at what the African American experience in the South was like after the Civil War. Of course, as you can imagine, freed slaves were excited about their freedom. There was some worry and anxiety and doubt that this was not as good of a deal as it was portrayed to them. Some slaves stayed in the South, stayed in their plantations, stayed with their family. Some, however, moved on, got out of Dodge as quickly as they could. For the first time, slaves now had freedom of movement. Once the freedom came through the emancipation and, of course, the end of the war, freed slaves took to the roads and looked for family members that had been sold off or who had run away or whatever have you. Now they also have freedom to own land. True freedom, they felt, would come only with economic independence. They were hoping, there had been some whispers and some plans out there that the land that they had spent most of their lives working on would be redistributed from the planters to them. In some parts of the South, this is a plan that worked. In other parts of the South, this was not even thought about. We could not possibly give these freed African Americans land in any way, shape, or form. They now had freedom of worship. Churches rose up everywhere throughout the South. Within these churches, thousands of volunteer groups, mutual aid societies, debate clubs, drama societies, and trade associations also sprang up. Now they're also given the freedom to learn. In 1860, 90% of African Americans could not read or write. Of course, it was against the law to have your slave learn to read or write. So that's a startling number. In an effort to help, many white teachers from the North went to the South in order to help set up schools. I'd like to think that's something that I would have done had I been alive at this time period. And between 1865 and 1870, Black educators also started about 30 African American colleges throughout the South, some of which still exist today. The Freedmen's Bureau is also born during this time period. This was essentially a program that Congress created in an effort to help Black Southerners adjust to freedom. It came about in March of 1865. It is our first major federal relief agency in U.S. history. That being said, it did lack strong support from Congress and unfortunately was dismantled in 1869. One thing that, or a couple things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was give out clothing, medical supplies, and meals. And about 250,000 African American students received their first formal education through schools that were set up by the Bureau. So it was pretty fundamental to help these freed slaves kind of get their grounding and get their feet underneath them during this time period. As Southern states were meeting the requirements to join the Union or rejoin the Union, white governments in the states started passing what were known as Black Codes. Black Codes are laws that restricted freedmen's rights. Some of these laws I'm going to tell you about, but this is not all of them. This is just a brief accounting of some of them. Curfews, for example. Black folks could not go out after sundown. Vagrancy laws. Freedmen were often convicted of vagrancy, which essentially means that they weren't working. You could be fined, whipped, or sold into a year's labor if you couldn't find a job or be out there looking for a job. Labor contracts. Freedmen had to sign agreements in January for a year of work. If you quit in the middle of this time period, you often lost all the wages that you earned. Labor restrictions. Freed people could rent land or homes only in rural areas, and this forced them to essentially live on plantations. Something that really came about during this Reconstruction period was the advent of new amendments. Annoyed with Southern states passing the Black Codes, Congress decided essentially to pass at least some new amendments here. The 14th Amendment, ratified by the states in 1868, states that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens of the U.S. and of the states wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment. Freedmen began demanding the rights of citizenship. They wanted to vote, hold public office, serve on juries, and, of course, testify in court. The amendment stated that no citizen may be denied the right to vote by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This